Our next speaker is Dr. Paul Clayton. What could I say? This guy's bio was so overwhelming that I just couldn't do the whole thing. I have to be honest. When I saw his bio, I just gave up. I have to say that I'm not a quitter, but I know my limits. He has written tons of publications and papers. Paul has been in so many different positions all over the world that I just couldn't count anymore. He has written many books, including Health Defense, After Atkins, Natural Defenses, Out of the Fire, Inflammaging, and Let Your Food Be Your Pharmaconutrition. Paul has a bunch of researches going on right now. So in my world, I just call this kind of guys a badass. Welcome, Paul Clayton.
A badass, huh? Okay. Well, in the spirit of Nordic compromise and consensus, let me say I respectfully disagree with everything you've just heard. I would also like to say that every time I come to Finland, it's cold, gray, and wet. So let me thank the organizers for bringing me here from Florida. I'm going to talk about public health issues, and I thought I'd start because the focus here is on sports-related issues by saying that it's not particularly healthy to be a professional sportsman or sports person or athlete. If you use life expectancy as an indicator of general health status, it's very crude, but it's reasonably effective. Then the professional sports person or athlete really doesn't score very differently from average. If you look at the very elite, at least in some sports, you find that Olympic medal winners tend to live a little longer, about 2.5 years on average. But let's put that in perspective. When they beat the average by 2.5 years, they're not doing any better than farmers or scientists. And in fact, the longest-lived professional group are the Nobel-winning scientists who are 5 or 6 years ahead of the average. But averages mean nothing. You really have to look at trends to understand what's going on. And frankly, the trends that we have to deal with are extraordinarily negative. All of these are diseases of what we euphemistically call civilization. If they are diseases of civilization, we have never been as civilized as we are today. All of these diseases, and they're very different kinds, are increasing in frequency and decreasing in latency. That is, we see more and more cases appearing in progressively younger cohorts of patients. And I'll start with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, which, as you all know, has been doubling every 10 to 15 years or so. If you look at the North American situation, more than half the adult population is now diabetic or pre-diabetic. And this represents a significant acceleration of the aging process through mechanisms that are by now quite well understood. So the diabetic loses about 8 years on average of life expectancy because they are more at risk of Alzheimer's, dementia in general, a range of cancers, peripheral neuropathies, retinopathies, end-stage renal disease, non-alcohol-related fatty liver disease. All of these conditions are becoming very hard for us to control. We no longer have enough medical personnel to supply adequate medical care. We don't have enough kidneys or livers for the transplants for people who need them. This ship of public health is sailing away from us. We can no longer keep up. And if that was all that there was, well, maybe we could find a way of reallocating resources. But the problem is actually much more diverse. It's much wider. If you look at the dementias in general, we see a similar pattern of increase. And in the people presenting with neurodegenerative death from Alzheimer's, Parkinsonism, or motor neuron disease, you can see here that in the last 35 years, in the over 75 age group, that has increased 300% in men and 500% in women. The average age of onset of these neurodegenerative diseases has fallen by about 10 years in the last 30 years. Same with diabetes. When I was at medical school in the 60s, we expected to see type 2 diabetes only in older patients. It was known as a disease of old age. We now see that in patients in their 30s, 20s, teens, and even in the pre-teens. So all of this represents a kind of an acceleration of the aging process. we're not only seeing increasing signs of damage of the brain in old age, we see increasing signs of neurodevelopmental disorders, brain problems, damage of the central nervous system that are occurring in the womb and in the first year to 18 months after birth. So the group of neurodevelopmental disorders, ADD, ADHD, dysphasia, dyspraxia, autism and Asperger's as well, all of those are showing very substantial increases. If whatever we are doing in our environment is damaging our brains in old age and at the start of life, what is it doing to you? Nothing good at all. And I'll show you some graphs a little bit later on to illustrate that particular point. But let's move on to a different range of diseases, the cancers. Take tobacco out of the equation, look at the non-tobacco related cancers, and since 1950, they have approximately doubled in age-matched cohorts. And it's not because we're becoming an older society. In fact, we are not. Life expectancy is falling now. We also find that same increase in cancers in younger and younger age groups, and this one in particular, bowel cancer, in a very young age group indeed, 22 to 37, that has actually quadrupled since the 1950s. And actually that signs of increase, it looks as if it's getting more rapid even today. Moving on from cancers to diseases that affect the connective tissues, osteoporosis and the osteoarthritic disorders. We are seeing far more cases of low-impact fracture. That's based on the work of Chris Obrandt, who works with the Swedish databases. There is all kinds of evidence showing that our skeletons are not as robust as they used to be, neither in, I would say, late adolescence in the 20s and 30s when you would expect to have your peak bone mineral density, but in later life as well. Again, when I was at medical school, we were taught that osteoporotic fractures, POTS or COLS or vertebral wedge fractures or femoral neck fractures, we would expect to see these in very old patients, and they were mostly female. Now 1 in 4 fractured hips is male. So this is a condition that is also increasing in frequency and decreasing in latency. As is osteoarthritis, the numbers of surgeries that we see being carried out in North America, and a lot, not all of this data is North American, that has increased by 300% and 200% respectively. I'll go to another group of disorders, those which involve the immune system. So if you look at asthma, that's increased by about 250% in the last 20 years, but it's not just asthma. There's a whole range of other atopic conditions involving the eyes, ears, nose, throat, and skin. They all show the same increase. And then these conditions, which are, we call them eosinophilic gastrointestinal diseases. You can think of them as a kind of asthma affecting the gastrointestinal tract. These conditions, too, are all showing exactly the same increase. And then finally, and this is a terrible slide. It's very, very crowded. When I started, it was only half this number of cases. I now have enough data to fill 2 slides, but I'm only showing you the top set. The autoimmune diseases, such as type 1 diabetes and Hashimoto's and Graves' and rheumatoid arthritis and hundreds of other autoimmune conditions, all of these are increasing too, by about 3 to 4% a year. Now, these are all very different diseases. And when you see a population, whether it's human or another animal species, where you start seeing an increasing frequency of a range of different diseases, when you see them starting to appear in progressively younger groups of subjects, you can only draw one conclusion. There is only one kind of underlying problem that presents with these kinds of epiphenomena, and that is, this is a population that is being chronically poisoned. You are being chronically poisoned. And I'm going to talk to you about how that makes you sick and how you can escape from this very negative situation that our public health is now in. First of all, what you have to take on board is that you will have dysnutrition or malnutrition. There's 2 ways of saying the same thing. And this was acknowledged by the World Health Organization in 2008. These are the experts who did various studies on different sides of the Atlantic. That's not my thing. I simply use their data. But everywhere where we look, when we measure and monitor what people actually eat, we find that they are very, very depleted, not just in vitamins and minerals, but in many other things as well. There's a problem there. And what we now understand is that this problem of dysnutrition or malnutrition very directly gives rise to chronic inflammation. And chronic inflammation, if you've been following the mass media for the last 5 years, you will know by now that chronic inflammation is considered to be the most important driver of the degenerative, non-communicable diseases. It's like an alkahest. It's the skeleton key. It explains many different diseases, and certainly all of these. So here we are in 2018, when it looks as if we have pretty good food security. But despite that, dysnutrition, poor diet, has been acknowledged to be the most important cause of early, which means avoidable, death all over the world. This was based on a very exhaustive body of work presented in The Lancet in 2015. Now, if all these diseases are becoming more frequent and occurring in progressively younger groups of subjects, we would expect to see life expectancy falling. You don't normally hear that. The story that you most often hear is that we're actually living longer. And you've seen graphs, I'm sure, that purport to show an increase in life expectancy from 1900 to 2000, and it looks like pretty steady progress, with just a couple of exceptions during the First and Second World War when there were minor differences. But in fact, life expectancy is not rising at all. It's been stable for quite some time. It's actually starting to fall. And I made a prediction back in 2000 that the first place where we would see life expectancy falling at a national level would be the United States. And in 2016, the CDC in Atlanta released a data set which said, yes, life expectancy is starting to fall at the national level. We had already seen this emerging in some very specific socioeconomic groups, and it was felt to be an isolated issue. My feeling was that these were bellwether groups and that we would see the same general trend occurring at the national level, and so it has proved to be. And that decrease in life expectancy has now increased for 3 years in a row. The CDC talked about this and they said, we don't know what's driving this. We've only seen this twice before, and once was in 1919, 1920, during the great Spanish flu pandemic, and then again there was a blip in the 80s, which was related to the height of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Right now, there are none of those factors that are taking place. You have heard probably people speculate that the neo-opioid abuse pandemic, which is a very major issue in North America, might be behind this. It is a small contributory factor. But if you read the CDC reports, you will see in the fine print that it is very clear that death from all the significant causes of death is increasing. It really isn't just overdoses. That's just something that the media are playing with. As soon as that data was released in 2016, I made another prediction. I said, well, if that's what's happening in America, the next country where we will see the fall in life expectancy is going to be the United Kingdom. And a month ago, our own National Office of Health Statistics released a report showing that life expectancy was falling in Britain too. And now I'd like to make another prediction. Life expectancy is going to start falling in Finland next. You're next. Yes. I'm terribly sorry. This is not personal. It's just business, okay? You're not alone. It's not going to be just Finland, but Germany, Ireland, and Poland will be showing the same data trends as you. So how can I be so specific? Very, very simple. This follows very exactly patterns of ultra-processed food consumption. Now, North America, the United States, Canada, and increasingly Mexico have the highest intakes of ultra-processed foods on the planet. Ultra-processed foods are typically foods containing large amounts of salt, sugar, plant oils, and not very much of anything else. So high calorific values, very low nutrient densities. So North America comes in top of the list, but who comes in next? Britain. Britain comes in at 50.7 of our food is now consumed as ultra-processed. And look who's in the third group, Ireland, Germany, Poland, and Finland. You're next. I speculate that within 24 months, life expectancy will start falling here too, despite the best efforts of your politicians and all your nice Finnish companies who are trying to digitize everything. They're spitting into the wind because the underlying currents are so negative and so damned destructive. So what ultra-processed foods look like? Some of you have seen foods like this. Some of you may even have sampled them. Why? Because they're convenient. We are time poor. We don't have enough time to go to the shopping market, buy unprocessed produce, and cook it for ourselves. So we buy these foods. It's also very difficult for us not to consume these foods because they're produced by food companies that are actually very immoral. There are companies that use something called advanced bliss point research to road test their foods. Are you familiar with bliss point? Do you know what this is? Very briefly, because I only have a short time to talk. Companies used to design new foods, hand them out to a panel, and say, what do you think? And they would take the scores and sum them up, and the one with the best score, that would be the variant they would try. The problem is that people lie. Everybody lies for all kinds of reasons. So what the food companies now do, they will give you their foods to taste, their new products, while your head is in a CT scanner. And we actually monitor activity in your pleasure centers. And you cannot lie about that. You cannot dissemble, you cannot hide. And what the food industry has now successfully done is produce foods which have the right combinations of sweet, salt, sour, crunch, mouthfeel, which are effectively addictive. They show all the criteria of being addictive. And one of the first foods that met these criteria and that was designed in this way was the Pringles chips. And if you remember, the marketing slogan was, once you pop, you can't stop. And that's actually quite accurate. They were designed to be addictive, and this is the reason why people eat so much of these kinds of foods, even if they know in their hearts that these are not particularly healthy for them. So some of you will admit to having eaten foods like this. Of course, none of you eat this kind of nonsense. But here is one of the worst offenders. This is just sugar and nothing else. So extremely high calorie density, no ability to satiate, a nutrient density of effectively 0. So here we all are, we're captives of a food industry which has abandoned any moral high ground and sells us stuff that improves their profit margin, but they have no interest whatsoever in our health or our well-being, and neither do our politicians, frankly, because we live in a corporatocracy, and most of your politicians and most of the European politicians are bought and rent and paid for by the hour by the companies who control the food space, which is one reason why we continue to get fatter, but we're getting fatter, and at the same time, it's a paradox, we aren't being nutritionally depleted. This is not only increasing the frequency of all those different diseases that I showed you in the first slide, but I also hinted that because it's neurotoxic in old age and it is damaging our brains at the beginning of life, it is also damaging our brains as well. And here is a meta-analysis, a study carried out by scientists at the universities of Hartford, Ulster, and Brussels. And what it shows is that since 1950, we have lost an average of 15 IQ points. We are becoming more stupid, ladies and gentlemen. And can I just say this was not done using IQ tests, the standard form, because they're culturally embedded. You can actually cheat, you can train yourself, you can improve your performance by between 10 and 15%, that's quite easy to do. This is something that uses an altogether harder, more neurological evidence set. And we're very confident in this data. We're getting more stupid. Every generation thinks that it's much smarter than its parents. The opposite is true. The opposite is true. Generations are becoming more and more stupid. Sorry, kids. But look, this is the most alarming thing about this graph. It shows no sign of slowing down. So if you're parents, or if you are like I am, a grandparent, you should be very concerned about what is happening to your children and grandchildren. We're getting more stupid. But does it matter? Because actually we're facing a more existential dilemma. Because we are also losing the ability to reproduce. This shows a reduction of sperm counts of almost 2/3 that has occurred over the same time period. We are seeing increasing numbers of males who are subfertile and frankly completely infertile, and the problems of female infertility are well known. Again, with this graph, the most alarming aspect is it shows no sign of slowing down, and if we continue on these trends, within 20 to 30 years, we are witnessing the prospect of uncontrollable population involution that is neither planned nor peaceful. It will be chaotic. So these are very substantial problems. And I don't see any political figures anywhere on the landscape, either in North America or in Europe, that have shown that they have the backbone and the brain to be able to deal with this. Is there an answer? Actually, there is. But to find that answer, we have to look backwards in time. In fact, we have to go back to the most well-defined of all the blue zones. Blue zones are a concept that we use in my field of medicine, and they describe typically geographical islands, such as Campo de Mela in Italy, the Mount Athos monasteries in Greece, the Loma Linda community in California. There's a handful of others, where people live a different lifestyle and experience very different health and life expectancies. Typically, it's a lifestyle that involves rather greater physical activity, more social networking, and a much higher intake of unprocessed foods. And the biggest blue zone of all is an island not in space, but in time. It's the second half of the 19th century, a period that we refer to in history as the mid-Victorian age in England. And this population was far healthier than you are, and their lifespan was longer than it is today. They had no modern medicine, surgery, or diagnostics. They didn't need it because the population was so healthy. Now, we think of them as having a low life expectancy, but that was only because the first 5 years of life were so fragile. High infant mortality. 1 in 4 children died before they reached the age of 5, which brings down life expectancy. Filter that out, and what you find is that these people actually matched us and in many ways outstripped us. But I want you to look at these two ladies here, the teachers of this particular school, and look at their body type. They're size 0. So how many calories a day do you think they were consuming? Guess. Anyone? You're very shy and reserved up here in the north.
2,000, 1,500.
Whatever happened to the old Viking spirit? I'm disappointed. 2,000?
2,500. 1,500.
1,500? Higher. Who'll give me 2,000? 2,500. Do I hear 2,500?
Okay.
2,500? 3,000. Anyone go for 3,000? 3,500. They're eating about 3,500 calories a day.
No way.
Yes, because they're so physically active. Everything they do is done by hand. No information technology, no internal combustion engines. They live a lifestyle that is extraordinarily physically active. And if you look at their menfolk, wow, they're something else again. Those guys are eating, and we know this because this is a society that documented itself very extensively. These guys are eating between 7,000 and 8,000 calories a day. And look at them. They're eating like Olympic athletes. And in fact, if you look at their workload, they outstripped today's Olympic athletes. Each one of those, they're called navigators. These are at the bottom of the socioeconomic pecking order. They're the group of people who transformed the face of 19th century England. They dug the canals, they built the bridges and the railways, and here what you see is they're constructing the railway system that started to connect the whole of the British Isles. And if you look at their contracts, every man is expected to dig from below his feet to above his head 20 tons of earth and rocks and gravel every day. Very few Olympic athletes today could do that. In fact, I don't think I can think of one that could do a workload of that nature. None of you. Most of you would be unable to manage even a single ton. They were able to do this. They were able to maintain this prodigious physical output because they were extraordinarily healthy. And they were extraordinarily healthy because they were eating completely unprocessed foods with a relatively low calorie density, but a proportionately very high nutrient density. And this protected them amazingly from chronic degenerative disease. Yes, they had cancer, they had dementia, they had heart disease. All those diseases were known. But we have all the records, we have all the case reports. Everything was documented in this period of history, and those diseases only occur at 10% of the levels that we see today in a population that lived as long as we do. And I'll talk very briefly about that figure of 10% because I think it's very important. First of all, it tells us that 90% of all the degenerative disease we see today is avoidable. 90%. We could close down hospitals and the entire cancer business if we were to find a way to reproducing that. But it's also important because if you ask oncologists or cardiologists how many of your patients have strong genetic risk factors, they'll say 10%. And what we believe the case is that at that time, because people's lifestyle was so healthy, because their diet was so nutrient-rich, it was only the people who had genetic risk factors who actually presented with these diseases. Everybody else was protected. So this enormous burden of public health today that is crushing us, that accounts for 10% of GDP in the average EU country, and in 20% in the United States, 90% of that is avoidable. Just pause and let that sink in for a while. Everything that you think about going in towards old age, everything that you think is normal, the thickening of arteries, the thinning of bone, the progressive loss of brain cells, the increasing risk of cancer, all of that is an artifact. It has nothing to do with biological aging. It is everything to do with the fact that you are being chronically poisoned by the food industry. Then things start to go wrong. It's an island in time because we lost the factors which created those advantages. We started to work instead with our backs and with our hands, we started working with our fingers. And then we stopped using our legs. This is a German invention. That's her engineer, Dr. Benz, who's half of Mercedes-Benz. And that changes everything. And I like this slide because it represents the transition from the age of muscle to the age of fossil hydrocarbons. And it changes everything. It changes the way we design our cities, and it creates the modern lifestyle. And this is a ridiculous example, obviously, of how extensively the car has changed our lifestyle. This is not the appropriate way to walk your dog. The dog's getting cardiovascular exercise. Its owner isn't. And obviously not many people do this. It does happen. I took this photograph outside Flint in Michigan, which is where the big four car manufacturers were based. But that's a very large way. But in that many, many small ways, and this is another example, I don't even have to go and change the channel on my television anymore, in very small ways as well, and many of them, our requirements to be physically active have been reduced. And we have become the least physically active generation of humans that has ever existed. No longer Homo sapiens, if we ever were, Homo sedescens. And if for those of you who know your Latin, that means sitting down humans, which is what we have become. So we're approximately a third less physically active than our grandparents. Our levels of physical activity have been reduced by between 50 and 75% since the 19th century. So we are eating far less. We're eating much, much, much less than we used to. And there's a paradox here. We're getting so much heavier, and the paradox is because of this little gap here, because of the development of these near addictive foods, and because at these very low levels of calorific throughput, our satiety mechanisms break down. Many of us are consuming an average of 100 to 200 calories a day more than we need, which is nothing, but that's 1,000 calories a week, 4,000 calories a month, and that's the reason why so many of us are getting heavier. But we're doing so at a very low rate historically of food intake. We're eating far, far less than those Victorians used to do, for example. And the nutritional content of the foods that we do eat is far, far lower. And that creates a situation where everybody is disnourished or malnourished. That's why malnutrition is the leading cause of preventable death worldwide. Now, this is type A malnutrition, which we find in the medical textbooks. That's not what I see in my patients. That's not what you have. You have type B malnutrition, where you have enough or maybe too many calories, but you're low in everything else. You're low in vitamins, in minerals, in the essential fiber types, in at least one, probably two of the essential fatty acids, in carotenoids, xanthophylls, polyphenols, methanogens, cyanogens, conditionally essential amino acids, and amino sugars. The list goes on and on and on, because you're eating so little, and the foods you're eating are so terrible. You're low in all of them, and this creates chronic inflammation. And these are the companies that are poisoning you. We have access to an enormously diverse range of foods today, more than we have ever before, but it's only a superficial diversity, because a lot of these processed foods all contain different extracts from a very small range of crops, such as soy and corn. High fructose corn syrup is scattered liberally through these foods. And another reason why this variation is deceptive is because behind all of those sub-brands, the familiar names, are actually only a very small number of mega corporations Danone, Unilever, Coca-Cola, Nestle, PepsiCo, I won't go through the whole list. These people own the international food universe. And they have created a food universe which is profoundly toxic. Now, it's not acutely toxic. So you can eat one of these products from Mars or Danone, and it's not going to kill you. You'll still be alive this time tomorrow. But if your diet is containing excessive amounts of these foods, and I know in Finland, you saw the figures, it's in the mid-40s, then this diet will kill you because it will create chronic inflammation through mechanisms that have been well characterized. So this is a food universe which has a very high 6-to-3 ratio. That causes chronic inflammation. It is a food universe from which the polyphenols have been reduced for reasons which I don't have time to go into. I'm trying to teach you a course that normally takes 6 months to my medical students, and I'm trying to teach you this in 30 minutes. So we're covering a lot of ground. But by taking the polyphenols out, this also creates chronic inflammation. There's a pathological lack of prebiotics, very, very important fibers that feed the gram-positive microorganisms in your microbiome. Take those fibers away, those gram-positive species are replaced by gram-negative species, which cause chronic inflammation. These compounds have been removed too, 1,3,1,6 beta-glucans, which means that your innate immune systems cannot function properly, which means you have more chronic inflammation. You get the picture? This is a food universe which is designed by accident, or possibly deliberately, to create chronic inflammation and make you stupid, less fertile, and die young. As if that wasn't enough, this is a food universe. All the anti-inflammatory compounds have been taken out, and they have been replaced by these compounds. And these compounds are not anti-inflammatory, they are pro-inflammatory. Advanced glycation and advanced lipoxidation end products. And the reason why they're present in such high levels in these processed foods is that when food companies make very large amounts of foods, in order to make them economically, they have to make them quickly, which means at high temperatures, and they use high temperature processes such as spray drying, which exceed the temperatures that you find in most domestic cooking processes. And that's what produces these compounds. And they're highly pro-inflammatory. And just to make matters worse, as if that wasn't already bad enough, they have completely the wrong electrolyte ratio, too much sodium, not enough magnesium, not enough potassium, which means that your smooth muscle is too excitable, which means that you are more likely, if you had asthma, for that asthma to become anaphylactic. You are more likely, if you have inflammation of the blood vessels, the arterioles, to suffer from essential hypertension. You are more likely to develop toxic preeclampsia. This is an extraordinarily toxic food universe. It causes chronic intoxication and is the reason why life expectancy has been falling in the United States, in Britain, and why it's falling here next. Each one of these factors, in its own way, drives chronic inflammation. And the process of chronic inflammation has also been unraveled. We know exactly what it is. It's quite simple. I'm sure this cartoon does not really need for me to go into it in detail. I'm only going to look at the relationship between the cellular chemistry and the physical chemistry. And that is what occurs in this reign here. It's the inflammasome. And this is a cartoon showing what the inflammasome is. Now, there are two phases in the inflammasome. In the upper phase, the most important thing that determines whether you have inflammation or not is the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in your cell membranes. And that is merely a reflection of the proportions of omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids in your diet. Now, if you have too many 6s and not enough 3s, and that's what that food universe gives you, your average ratio is about 15 to 1. It should be about 2 to 1. It's 15 to 1 now. Then what that means is you create lipid mediators in the peripheral tissues which drive chronic inflammation. That is not yet causing tissue damage. What it does, it leads to the extrusion of intracellular organelles called lysosomes. And once these have been extruded into the extracellular space, they break down and then they release enzymes called matrix metalloproteinases. Highly destructive enzymes. Now, the activity in this upper phase is determined by the 6-to-3 ratio, and you all have the wrong 6-to-3 ratio. It's far too high. But luckily, in this second phase, there's another dietary protective factor, the polyphenols, but those have gone too. So here is the data showing the 6-to-3 ratios. This is the best data that we have. They've been about 2-to-1 for as long as we can record, but starting in 1900, they start to diverge. People start eating less seafoods. They're eating more plant oils, partly because of those same food companies I showed you before. The average now in Europe is about 15-to-1. In the United States, it's 25-to-1, which is why America is such a deeply sick society. They're 5% of the global population. They depend on over 54% of all the prescription pharmaceuticals in the world. That is how deeply sick they are. And we are going exactly in the same direction. We're going exactly in the same direction. And if you look at the polyphenols, if you compare polyphenol intake to the patterns of consumption that we have recorded in the 19th century, for all kinds of reasons, they have fallen by about 90%. So to go back to this inflammasome, in the upper chamber, the 6-to-3 ratio has become completely pathological. That is driving chronic inflammation. And so the upper phase of the inflammasome is running hot. But then these compounds, the polyphenols, have disappeared, which means that the lower phase of the inflammasome is also running hot. So now you're releasing all these enzymes, the matrix metalloproteinases, and what do? They destroy the extracellular matrix. This is a three-dimensional mesh of microfibers that runs through your entire body. It holds all your cells together in the correct alignment, allowing them to coordinate, to communicate with each other, and to function collectively as a tissue or as an organ. Without those fibers, without the extracellular matrix holding them together, they dissolve. They lose all their organization. They lose their function. You start to die. Now, when you talk about matrix metalloproteinases, it's key to the concept of chronic inflammation. But you probably already know about them, because these are the same enzymes that are released by flesh-eating bacteria. The very same. When you were infected by a flesh-eating bacterium, it turns you into soup. These enzymes dissolve everything. They dissolve skin, muscle, fascia, bone. They dissolve everything. And it's the same enzymes that are released, but in smaller amounts and much more slowly over time, that cause chronic degenerative disease. This is what causes the loss of cartilage in osteoarthritis. This is what causes the slow loss of osteoid in bone that leads over time towards that first fracture. This is what leads to the progressive destruction of the nerves inside your skull, so that over time you become more forgetful and you start to dement. It is this same process that is at the core of almost all the chronic degenerative diseases. This one single process. We used to think that these were all separate diseases, and if you go into the medical schools now, these diseases are still treated as if they were separate. All these specialists sitting in their silos, not realizing that they're all looking at epiphenomena, symptoms of a common underlying problem, which is chronic inflammation. That is now understood to be our core problem. So it is the food universe, this toxic food universe, that causes chronic inflammation, which causes slow tissue damage, which causes coronary artery disease, cancer, osteoporosis. I mean, all of the other major healthcare issues of our time. We thought they were all so separate. It turns out that these are all deeply connected. So when I see a patient presenting with, let's say, coronary artery disease, when I look at them carefully, I will find that they have signs of almost all the other chronic degenerative diseases, but at a preclinical stage. It's just that in this particular case, because of their lifestyle or because of their genetic makeup, the chronic inflammation has made more progress in the heart and the arteries than it has in the other tissues. But someone else, it might drive more rapidly in the bones, and they present with a fracture. So these diseases are really all different facets of the same thing. So by now, you should be asking yourself whether you have chronic inflammation. You do. You have dysnutrition. You have chronic inflammation. The problem is we can't test for it very accurately because it's such a slow process. These fires are very banked down. They're burning over periods of 10, 20, 30 years, and it's very difficult for us to measure. We have tools such as HSCRP. It's not very efficient. It's not sufficiently powerful enough for us to be able to measure the slow progress of a degenerative disease. So we don't use markers. We cannot use markers. Instead, we have to become very old-fashioned doctors and look at our patients' clinical conditions. So if you have, for example, raised diastolic blood pressure, if you have an allergy, if you have any condition which ends in itis, which actually means chronic inflammation, if you have vascular veins or hemorrhoids or depression, these are all symptoms of chronic inflammatory stress. So if any of these seem familiar to you, this is what you have. And the first thing that you should do is to actually measure your biochemical proclivity for chronic inflammation. The easiest way to do that is to take a blood test and have your 6-3 fatty acid profiles read. And for those of you who are interested, and I think I'm running out of time, the solution is very, very simple. This is an omega-3 lipophile polyphenol combination that has been developed at a number of different universities, and which we find switches off chronic inflammation in almost every tissue in the body. Once you do that, once the fires have been put out, the body's own amazing ability to heal and regenerate comes to the fore. And what we see is that diseases that we thought were degenerative and that were entropic are none of the sort. We see healing. This is anathema to the orthodox medical model, which is based on a pharmaceutical intervention. When you look at it from this perspective, it turns out that most of aging can be stabilized, most of aging can be reversed. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And now it's a great opportunity to ask some questions. Actually, we maybe have only time for one question, but the fastest can ask the question. Well, that was fast.
Hello there, Marko Saatro from Finnish television. Do you see any way that this could turn around in other ways than taking more vitamin pills or oils?
Yes. The most effective way for you to get healthy is to leave the cities, go and buy a small farm, work on the land, get your hands dirty, get the sunshine on your back, catch your own fish and game, and live a lifestyle that we're actually more biologically suited to. However, if you're a denizen of the digital society and you live in a city, forget it. For you, supplements or fortified foods have now become a necessity. As a pharmacologist, a clinical pharmacologist, I don't care how you do it, but you need to improve the nutrient density of your foods. That one product that I illustrated is the most effective way we've discovered so far of doing it, but others are coming. Anyone who's interested and who'd like to know more, there is a stand in the back run by Zinzino, and they have, I think, a limited number of blood tests, which you can just do for free, find out for yourself what your risk is. And I think they have a limited number of books which will give you a kind of a breakdown of what the problem is and how to solve it yourself.
Thank you very much.